Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video we are going to be looking at 10 tracks by JACO Pastorius you've never heard. Well, you might have heard some of them, but the thing is with JACO Pastorius, the legendary bass player that emerged in the mid-70s in the jazz fusion genre, is unlike his contemporaries. JACO Pastorius became a superstar within the music industry. His incredible virtuoso bass playing, along with his charismatic good looks, turned him into an absolute superstar. Because of that, he was in demand. He sold records, he sold concert tickets. After emerging with his solo album JACO Pastorius, which really changed the face of bass playing, he then joined Weather Report, and he joined Weather Report at a time when they were about to hit superstar themselves with the album Heavy Weather and the single Birdland that sold millions of copies, became one of the biggest selling albums in jazz history. And JACO was at the centre of that, with his charisma, his good looks, incredible playing, really being pushed by the labels. This is back in the 70s when jazz fusion was something that sold records. This is what you have to remember. So JACO became in demand. If JACO was on an album of yours, it could make or break the album. He then went on to appear on albums by Joni Mitchell, which were mainstream albums, in a way pop albums, although very creative albums, okay? If you dig deep into the discography of JACO Pastorius, you start to find a lot of tracks that he played on which aren't that well known within the canon of JACO. When you have JACO fans, they tend to go towards, stuff off Heavy Weather, the Hejira, for example. They will go off the solo albums by JACO. There's a number of albums that people will go towards. If you start to dig deeper, there are some really incredible tracks by JACO Pastorius where he's not just playing on them, but he is really soloing and doing his JACO thing. And I thought it would be brilliant to just try and pull 10 of those tracks together and give them a little bit more of a spotlight, and it sort of forms into almost like a new JACO Pastorius album, okay? There's also a few anomalies in there. JACO did a couple of quite weird things in his career, and I'd like to cover that as well. So, I would love to play the tunes in this video, but this video may get blocked if I did that. So what I've done is I've created a playlist in the description, and if you click on that, you can sit and listen to the 10 tracks in the order that I'm about to talk to you in. Right, so shall we start off with the first track on my imaginary esoteric album of JACO Pastorius? Right, I would open up this album with the tune The One Thing off Manolo Badrena's self-titled debut album that came out in 1979. Manolo Badrena had also shot to fame in Weather Report, and because of that, I think it's A&M Records offered him a deal, and he comes out with his self-titled debut album, Manolo, which is a fantastic album. It opens up with a really kicking, poppy, funky Latin tune called The One Thing, which features JACO doing his JACO funky thing. It's absolutely fantastic. It's catchy, but it sounds like something that should be off Heavy Weather. It's an absolutely fantastic track. Manolo Badrena, fantastic percussionist. He's also singing on here. It's got a catchy chorus, and it also features some really great guitar playing from the late great Carlos Rios, one of the great jazz fusion guitarists. So that would be the first, tune on my list. Right, so the second track I've chosen for this album would be Las Olas, which is off the Flora Purim album, Every Day, Every Night, which was released on Warner Brothers in 1978. This is an actual JACO Pastorius composition. A great composition as well. I think JACO, for me, he's important as a musician. He was an incredible bass player, and sometimes some of my comments sound like I'm playing JACO's bass playing down. He was a fantastic bass player, but I think there was a little bit of a cult around JACO. And I think there's other bass players that were also doing incredible stuff at the same time. This idea that JACO is somehow greater than any other bass player at the time, I'm not too sure of. I'm always suspicious when anybody says any musicians like that. You know, obviously Stanley Clarke was also pushing the boundaries of bass playing. It's exactly the same time, but incredible bass player. But as a composer, I do think that JACO is one of the great jazz composers of the 1970s. His compositions are absolutely incredible, and I think that really is where his legacy lies, in that so often his bass sound and that melodic tone that he had fits so beautifully with in his compositions. On this album by Flora Purim from 1978, this track Laswell is a brilliant example of a JACO Pastorius composition. Flora Purim is an incredible Latin American singer that is really the voice of jazz fusion. She sort of came to fame in Return to Forever, the first lineup, Chick Corea's Latin American jazz crossover band from the early 70s. She was married to Airto, who is again one of the great jazz fusion percussionists, you know, who sort of came to fame in Miles Davis's group. They were a centre of so many recordings. And if you like Latin American jazz fusion, then Flora Purim and Airto are essential artists. The album I grew up with by Flora was Butterfly Dreams, which was a very similar sound to the original Return to Forever. As the 70s progressed and that whole Fusac thing began to bite in, which is the point where JACO is really at his peak of fame, we see Flora moving more and more towards more commercial sound. And this album, which is called Every Day, Every Night, is definitely moving towards that. But this track is really heavy. It's some beautiful playing. It's a beautiful composition. And I think it really shows off JACO's melodic side so well. Okay, so the third track on my imaginary album would be Sunday, off the self-titled album by Michel Colombier that was released in 1979, called Michel Colombier. That's why I said it was self-titled. Right, so who's Michel Colombier? Well, he's a film composer, French film composer that has created hundreds and hundreds of soundtracks. He was also involved in the arrangement and production of various pop artists, French pop artists, like Michel Polnareff, right, who is a French superstar pop singer that is going to crop up later in this video. Sorry about my pronunciation, I am British. There seems to be a strong connection between Michel Colombier and JACO Pastorius. I think they work with each other quite a lot. Michel Colombier brings in a jazz fusion element into his soundtracks that he was creating at the time. And in 1979, he put together a jazz fusion album that was released, as I said, on Chrysalis Records. And I own this album. I've lost it, but I own this album when I was very young. And I really think it is one of the great jazz fusion albums of all time. It's an incredible album. And Sunday, which is the track I've pulled in, is an absolute brilliant example of JACO Pastorius playing in a funky jazz fusion setting. It's absolutely top-notch jazz fusion. I can't recommend this album too highly. The playing on it is absolutely fantastic. It's got Herbie Hancock on there. Michel Colombier, I think, is just such a strong composer that which is always what makes music great in the end, is the compositions. And Sunday, this track, it does not fall into the pitfalls of Fusac. It's kicking, it's funky, the solos are out there, the drumming's beautiful, and JACO just bubbles his way through as only JACO can. It's a brilliant example of JACO Pastorius playing the bass in a jazz fusion band. So that's what I got. Number 3 is Michel Colombier off his self-titled album, and it's the track Sunday. Okay, so the next track is a solo album by the saxophone player Bob Mintzer. Now, Bob Mintzer came to fame as a big band saxophone player in the early 70s. I think he played with Thad Jones and Buddy Rich. When JACO formed his big band in the early 80s, he pulled Bob Mintzer in. I think Bob Mintzer's experience as an incredible soloist, but also his knowledge of big band arrangements, must have been a great help for JACO in that band. Of course, Bob Mintzer's then star was on the rise because he's played JACO Pastorius, so he get offers a deal and he makes a fusion album in 1982 on Airto Records called The Source. This is a really, really great album. Bob Mintzer's a really, really great player, really strong soloist. Again, great compositions. The strongest composition on that album for me is the track Spiral, which is a really kicking sort of post-Brecker Brothers, funky yet, you know, proper, out there jazz tune. This is quite rare for 1982. By 1982, most jazz fusion was starting pretty rotten and was going down the route of you know, sequences and reverb and all that sort of stuff. But this is full out jazz fusion. It's really is a good album. This is the thing about exploring some of these more esoteric JACO tracks, is there's some absolute beauties here, and this is another one. This is an absolute fantastic track. And what's really interesting here to JACO Pastorius fans is JACO is sharing the bass with another bass player. He's sharing the bass duties with Tom Barney. Now, Tom Barney at that time had briefly got the gig with Miles Davis, replacing Marcus Miller. He's somewhere between Marcus Miller and Darryl Jones. He doesn't seem to be there for that long. And but I think Tom Barney's star was on the rise as well. Now, Tom Barney is more in the Marcus Miller mould, and he's a slap bass player. So what we hear is certain parts of this tune have slap bass on it, and certain parts have JACO soloing, and he's soloing all over the place. This is a proper full-out jazz fusion tune. Absolutely fantastic. Go and check it out. It's a really great example of JACO soloing. There's so much breadth here in this list. It really showcases everything that JACO does pretty much. Right, so on my album, I'd be imagining that this would be coming to the end of side one now, and I'm going to finish off side one with Nativity by Airto. Mentioned him earlier, off his album I'm Fine, How Are You, that came out in 1977. This tune is a really calm, spacey improvisation between Airto and JACO. And JACO does all his signature things on here. He plays the harmonics, you get that beautiful tone, he really improvises. One of the things that frustrates me with JACO, sometimes on the more famous stuff, is I always feel often that his solos have been very prepared. You know, I feel like he's worked on those solos, he's worked out certain phrases. I also think as JACO develops as a player, we start to hear him doing the sort of showboating licks that he got famous for, you know, like playing, you know, the Hendrix Third Stone from the Sun, and then doing the delay thing. These are all the things that JACO got known. And I love to hear JACO really just solo, just improvise. And that's what this sounds like. And it's absolutely classic JACO. Nativity off I'm Fine, How Are You by Airto. Go and check it out. This is like a real example of JACO at his best, and I really don't know why these tunes aren't more well known. So that would close off my side one of my album. So what we're going to open up side two. Now, side two, I've decided to get a little bit more weirder. You know, when I was telling you about Michel Colombier and how he'd arranged, you know, film soundtracks and stuff for sort of French pop stars, and I mentioned the French pop star Michel Polnareff. I hope I've said that better. Michel Polnareff emerged in the late 60s as in the sort of classic French chanteuse style. Very great singer. There's no dirt or blues in there. It's very pure. He's got this incredible range. It's quite interesting that he seems to have a nervous breakdown in the early 70s when an associate of his committed suicide. And he came out of that breakdown with an aversion to sunlight. So from those moments on, he's always seen in these very dark sunglasses and his sort of trademark bubble blonde perm, right? In the mid-70s, you know, obviously spurred on by the disco movement, he goes into the studio with Michel Colombier and he makes an album called Coucou Mon Revieux, Revoilà. So this is terrible. You know, if you'll notice, I don't like covering anything with Shall I try it again? So I'm really going to go for this now. So Michel Polnareff in 1978 made an album called Coucou Mes Revoilù. That's about the best I can do. All right. And it's a great album, actually. It is sort of that sort of French chanteur style, you know, channeled through disco, but it's a really, really funky album. I really did enjoy listening to it. Michel Polnareff does cut a quite strange looking character, I must admit, and it's an image that he seems to have kept to this day. On this track, there is a tune called Un Simple Mélodie. So I did the accent then. You hear that? I don't want to go too far into doing the French accent because I know it will not work. And JACO Pastorius plays on it. This is a beautiful pop song with JACO playing bass. It's quite interesting to hear him, you know, and he just adds so much class to this tune. As soon as you hear that singing bass tone weaving its way through the lower regions of this song, it just adds something to it. If you check out the playlist, there's actually a video that they made at the time, which you know, features Michel Polnareff, you know, in a park somewhere singing this tune with the trademark ridiculous sunglasses and bubble blonde perm. You know, it's well worth checking out. It's a real strange anomaly, I can't even say the English words now, in the catalogue of JACO Pastorius. So that's what I would open up. Right, so JACO Pastorius first emerged on the jazz scene around about 1974 as an associate with Pat Metheny. Before he did anything else, before he did the first Pat Metheny album or his solo album, he made a really incredible album with Paul Bley, Pat Metheny on guitar and Bruce Ditmas on drums. This album hasn't got a title, but it's become known as JACO, I think because JACO became so famous. I don't know if the album was then repackaged. It's an essential album in JACO's catalogue and it sometimes gets missed off. I think Bright Size Life has snatched the headlines as being that album. This album for me is just as great. Paul Bley is one of the great pianists in jazz. The compositions on here are by his wife Carla Bley. An absolutely incredible album. And I've put the track Vampira, which opens up side 2 on the album, on this list because it's just so signature JACO bass playing at the time. What's really interesting about this album is listening to Pat Metheny play guitar. Pat's approach is much more influenced by classic jazz fusion at the time. He's bending notes, he has a more cutting tone, and you can hear, if not channeling John McLaughlin, at least John Abercrombie, you can hear that sound. It's quite interesting. It's not the signature Pat Metheny sound. And I just wonder whether the powers that be around Pat have tended to, you know, downplay this album. And I'm sure Pat, who seems to, you know, like to be in control of how he is presented as an artist, may well have not championed this album as much as Bright Size Life, which he seems to not be 100% happy with that, you know, which even though it's a classic masterpiece, I'm sure I'm delving into areas that I shouldn't hear, and I may well stop there. But I sometimes wonder why this album is not more well known, because it is the great debut of JACO. Right, so the next one on the list is possibly the weirdest one I've been able to uncover. Anybody who watches my channel knows I'm a huge fan of Bill Laswell. the producer, bass player, improviser, genius that emerged in the late 70s with his own work, and then bands like Material and Last Exit, and absolute genius producer that produced album by Public Image Limited. He produced Mick Jagger albums, and he is the guy behind Rocket for Herbie Hancock. This guy should really be more discussed when we start talking about jazz fusion. One of Bill Laswell's genius moves was to be able to put really diverse musicians together in the studio. Now, in the 80s, he formed a group called Deadline, and Deadline is pretty much, it's very similar to his group Material. You can almost like swap them out. You could treat Deadline albums and Material albums. And in 1985, Deadline released an album called Down by Law, and on one track we have JACO Pastorius. Now this is really odd because this is 1985, so JACO at this point is really on the decline. This is the point where he wasn't getting hired, and it makes me wonder how he ended up in the studio with Bill Laswell making this record. The other bass player on here, apart from Bill Laswell, is the great Jonas Hellborg as well. He's on the sessions here as well, and Jonas had an association with JACO, or was at least thought of in the same way. So we've got these two incredible bass players. JACO appears on a track called Makosa Rock, which is written by the African jazz musician Manu Dibango, right? The lineup on here is quite astonishing. We have on harmonica Paul Butterfield. We have Manu Dibango on saxophone. We have from Parliament Funkadelic on keyboards Bernie Worrell, and then on trumpet the great free jazz trumpeter Aludara, who also happens to be the dad of the rapper Nas, with JACO Pastorius. Now JACO on here doesn't do that much, but what he does do is definitely signature JACO, and it's really weird to hear him in that Bill Laswell world. I would have loved to seen that explored more. So that's what I've got at whatever number that was. I think at number 6 is Makosa Rock by the band Deadline from 1985, from the album Down by Law. One of JACO's first forays into the studio was in 1974 for a group called Little Beaver, although Little Beaver is actually the pseudonym for a musician called Willie Hale, who made an album in 1974 called Party Down. It was quite difficult for me. I couldn't actually find, when I was researching into this album, which was the track that JACO was on. So I ended up just playing the album. I just put the album on and had a listen to it. And then suddenly this track emerges, and it was just obvious. This is the genius of JACO. You don't need to know the credits, because as soon as he's on a track, he's on a track. This is 1974, right? The guy's never really recorded for. He was in the studio with Little Beaver, and again, we have this signature sound. It's so strong. The track's called I Can Dig It. Really funky track, early 70s funk. JACO is sounding as funky as hell. Go and check it out, right? Okay, so the last... No, where... Oh my God, I've got stuck now. That was... Little Beaver was number 9, so I got my numbers all wrong. Sorry about that. The last track on my album is called Lost Inside the Love of You Reprise by Tom Scott off the Intimate Strangers album, and this would close off my album. Again, it's another beautiful tune played by JACO. I want to talk a little bit about Tom Scott here. Tom Scott's career within jazz and jazz fusion is monumental, and I've never mentioned him on the channel. He's the son of Nathan Scott, who was a TV theme composer. He composed the theme for Dragnet. Tom Scott emerges as a very young virtuoso player in the late 60s. I have him on an album by Roger Kellaway called Spirit Feel from 1967, when he must be about 16, 17 years old, and he's playing incredibly on that album. He then goes on into the early 70s, emerges, forms the band LA Express. LA Express is then picked up by Joni Mitchell, and he plays on all those classic early 70s Joni Mitchell albums. He then starts making his own albums. He then starts to write for TV. He writes the Starsky and Hutch theme, The Streets of San Francisco, which is fascinating when you think his dad did that. He's also playing on a whole ton of incredible records, from mainstream pop all the way through to fusion. He makes an album in 1976-77 called Blow It Out, which is a big hit, which features the theme from Starsky and Hutch. This guy played saxophone on Billie Jean. Did you even know there's a saxophone on there? Well, it doesn't sound like it because it's Lyricon, but he's on Billie Jean. But you know, Tom Scott's career is huge, and I need to touch on it more. After the success of Blow It Out in 1970, when would it be? 77, I think. He then brings an album out called Intimate Strangers in 1978, and of course you get your JACO Pastorius appearance on there. And again, this is beautifully composed, beautiful JACO, you know, playing absolute beautiful tune. And that would close my album out. So that is my 10 JACO Pastorius tunes that you have probably, I've now changed it to probably in brackets, probably never heard. Going through this, it makes me realise how much, for me, the famous JACO Pastorius tunes, I've just heard so much that you could forget the initial shock of hearing him for the first time, because it becomes such a sound that you're aware of and comfortable with. And then checking him out in other contexts you've never heard like this is really fascinating. And the thing that comes across about him, beyond all the virtuosity and cleverness and all the techniques and harmonics, is that sound. You know, JACO was a sound innovator, like Miles Davis. He changed the sound of the instrument, and it's that singing sound which goes beyond the sort of rudimental role of the bass to just underpin the music. It becomes a character, and it's his personality and character that we hear within that. And it's a winsome approach, which is singed with great sadness, which sort of is JACO's character in itself. You know, it's fascinating to hear it, and it's wonderful to hear him in these new contexts. So I hope you're not aware of these tunes, and I hope for some of you who are JACO Pastorius can sit back. You know, this isn't just leftovers and stuff. This is some really incredible playing from JACO. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. If you like this, please like. If you want to see more, subscribe and ring the notification bell. And if you want to support me in what I'm doing and see a whole ton of other content which goes far beyond what I do here, then pop across to my Patreon and become a patron. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.